A pouch of mountain gold was supposed to buy Beau Thatcher a quiet piece of Montana dirt. Instead, the auctioneer's gavel struck, and this rugged trapper accidentally purchased a battered, terrified young woman. What followed was a bloody, desperate fight for survival that shook the entire western frontier. The spring thaw of 1881 had turned the streets of Helena, Montana territory into a thick, impassable soup of mud and horse manure. For Beau Thatcher, the filth of civilization was an assault on the senses. Beau was a man of the high country, carved from the granite and timber of the Bitterroot Mountains. Standing 6'4" in his heavy buffalo hide coat, with a beard as thick as pine brush and eyes the color of a stormy sky, he looked every bit the wild mountain man he was. For 10 years he had trapped beaver-hunted elk and lived entirely alone. But the winters were getting harder. The mountain quiet was starting to feel like a graveyard, and Beau had decided it was time to come down. He wanted a farm. He wanted a piece of earth that didn't threaten to freeze him to death every December. Hanging heavily from his gun belt was a leather pouch filled with pure, unrefined placer gold, the bloody, sweat-soaked culmination of a decade's work. According to the historical territorial ledgers of Lewis and Clark County, a property auction was scheduled for that Tuesday on the courthouse steps. The prized listing was Lot 71, a 40-acre spread in the Prickly Pear Valley, formerly owned by a notorious local drunkard named Jebediah Rutledge. Jebediah had defaulted on everything he owned, gambling his life away in the back rooms of town. The bank was foreclosing, and the county was liquidating the estate. Beau stood in the back of the crowd, his thumbs hooked into his gun belt, watching as the fast-talking auctioneer, Phineas G. Walsh, took the podium. "Lot 71, gentlemen," Walsh barked, wiping sweat from his brow, despite the chill in the air. 40 acres of prime valley soil, a 2-room cabin, a sturdy barn, and all attached livestock and chattel on the premises. Bidding starts at $300. The bidding was fierce among the local cattle barons, but Beau was resolute. Every time a suited gentleman raised a hand, Beau's deep, gravelly voice cut through the clamor. 500, 700, 1,000. When the bidding reached $1,500, the crowd fell dead silent. It was an astronomical sum for a run-down farm, but Beau Thatcher didn't care. He walked up the wooden steps, unhooked the heavy leather pouch, and dropped it onto the auctioneer's table. The gold hit the wood with a thunderous thud. "There's 2,000 in raw dust and nuggets in there," Beau rumbled. "Keep the change. Give me the deed." Walsh, eyes wide with greed, hastily signed the transfer papers. Beau Thatcher was officially a landowner. An hour later, Beau rode his massive draft horse Goliath out to the valley. The Montana sky was a brilliant, sweeping blue, and for the first time in his life, Beau felt a profound sense of peace. That peace, however, evaporated the moment he laid eyes on the Rutledge property. The cabin was little more than rotting timber and broken glass. The fields were choked with dead weeds. Shaking his head, Beau led Goliath toward the barn, hoping the structure was in better shape. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The smell of decay and stale hay hit him instantly. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the rustle of rats or the snort of a leftover mule. It was a whimper, a human whimper. Beau drew his Colt revolver and stepped cautiously into the shadows. "Who's there?" he barked. In the farthest stall, chained to a heavy support beam by an iron shackle around her ankle, was a woman. She couldn't have been older than 22. Her dress was little more than filthy, torn rags. Her face was heavily bruised, her lips split, and her dark hair was matted with dried blood and dirt. She scrambled backward into the dirt, pressing her frail body against the wooden wall, her wide, terrified eyes locked on Beau's massive, imposing figure. She was shaking so violently that the iron chain rattled against the wood. Beau froze, the revolver dropping to his side. "Good God," he breathed. He took a slow step forward, raising his empty hands. "Easy. Easy, I ain't gonna hurt you." She flinched, as if struck, curling into a tight ball, squeezing her eyes shut. "Please," she croaked, her voice raw and ruined. "I'll be good. I'll work. Please don't let him come back. Please." Beau's mind raced. He approached, slowly kneeling in the dirt mere inches from her. He reached out to inspect the iron shackle. There was no padlock. It was hammered shut. With a surge of raw, adrenaline-fueled strength, Beau took the heavy iron poker from the nearby forge, wedged it into the chain's weakest link, and snapped the rusted metal in two. The woman gasped, staring at her newly freed leg, then up at the giant mountain man. "Who did this to you?" Beau asked, his voice low and dangerous. My husband," she whispered. "Jebediah. He said he lost the land. He said he had to leave me behind to pay the interest." Beau felt a sickening twist in his gut. He reached into his coat and pulled out the deed he had just signed. He read the fine print at the bottom of the page, the words blurring in his rage. "Including all standing structures, livestock, and attached chattel, in the lawless, corrupt edges of the 1881 frontier loopholes in the territorial domestic dependency, acts allowed a man to classify an indebted mail-order bride as property." Jebediah Rutledge hadn't just abandoned his wife. He had legally sold her to the highest bidder to cover his debts. Beau Thatcher hadn't just bought a farm. He had bought a broken bride. Fury, hot and blinding, surged through Beau's veins. He took off his thick buffalo hide coat and gently draped it over the woman's trembling shoulders. It swallowed her whole. "What is your name?" he asked softly, trying to mask the murderous rage simmering behind his eyes. "Matilda," she whispered, clutching the heavy fur tightly around her neck. "Matilda Hayes, from St. Louis." "Well, Matilda," Beau said effortlessly, lifting her into his arms. She weighed no more than a child. "We're going back to town." Beau rode Goliath hard, the great horse, thundering over the muddy trails back into Helena. He didn't stop at the sheriff's office. He rode straight to the clinic of Dr. Horace Meade, a gruff but honest frontier physician. Beau kicked the clinic door open and laid Matilda on the examining table. "Fix her, Horace," Beau demanded, tossing a gold nugget onto the doctor's desk. "And keep her safe. I have a judge to kill." Before the bewildered doctor could ask a single question, Beau was back on the street, marching toward the Lewis and Clark County Courthouse with the heavy, purposeful strides of a man going to war. He found Judge Harmon Baxter in his chambers, sipping whiskey and counting a stack of greenbacks. Beau didn't knock. He kicked the heavy oak door off its iron hinges. The door crashed to the floor, and Beau crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing the corrupt judge by the lapels of his expensive suit and slamming him against the wall. "You sold me a human being, Baxter." Beau roared the walls of the courthouse, shaking with his voice. Judge Baxter gasped for air, his face turning purple. "Thatcher, put me down. It's perfectly legal. It's the territorial code." Beau dropped him, but kept his hand resting menacingly on the butt of his Colt. "Explain." Baxter adjusted his collar, trembling. Jebediah Rutledge owed over $3,000 to Amos McCoy. You know McCoy, Beau. He runs the Silver Dollar Saloon, and half the territory's underground. Rutledge was a dead man. He legally transferred his marital contract to the estate as chattel to clear the books. McCoy pushed the auction through my court to launder the transaction. You bought the deed, you bought the debt, and you bought the girl. Beau's jaw clenched. Amos McCoy was a ruthless, bloodthirsty tyrant who employed a dozen rejected Pinkerton mercenaries to enforce his will. McCoy owned the town. "She ain't property," Beau growled. "Nullify the deed. I want her free." "I can't," Baxter pleaded. If I nullify it, the property defaults to Amos McCoy, and McCoy doesn't want the dirt Thatcher. He wants the girl. He plans to put her to work in the cribs behind the silver dollar to pay off the rest of Jebediah's interest. If she isn't legally yours, McCoy's men will take her tonight." Beau stood frozen in the opulent office. The horrifying reality of the situation washed over him. If he walked away, if he renounced the deed, he was handing a battered, helpless woman over to a monster. He was a solitary mountain man. He didn't want a wife. He didn't want responsibility. But the code of the mountains was simple. You don't leave a wounded creature to the wolves. "Fine," Beau spat, turning on his heel. "She's mine. Tell McCoy if he comes near my property, I'll bury him under it." When Beau returned to the clinic, Dr. Mead had finished binding Matilda's ribs and treating her lacerations. She was sitting up dwarfed by Beau's coat, looking at the door with a quiet, terrified resignation. When Beau walked in, she braced herself, expecting the worst. Men in her life had only ever meant pain. "Are you taking me to the saloon?" she asked, her voice cracking. I heard the doctor muttering about Amos McCoy. "No," Beau said, gently stepping into the room. "I'm taking you home, to the farm." Over the next 3 weeks, the Rutledge farm underwent a transformation. Beau worked from dawn until dusk, driven by an unyielding, restless energy. He ripped out the rotting floorboards of the cabin and laid fresh pine. He repaired the roof, fixed the stove, and cleared the fields of dead brush. Through it all he kept his distance from Matilda. He knew his size, and his ruggedness terrified her. He slept outside on the porch in the freezing Montana nights, wrapped in a blanket, leaving the warmth of the cabin entirely to her. He brought her fresh meat from his hunts, left clean water by the door, and spoke only in soft, brief sentences. Slowly the profound silence of the valley and Beau's gentle consistency began to work a miracle. The deep purple bruises on Matilda's face faded into pale yellow, and the hollow emptiness in her eyes was replaced by a cautious curiosity. She started stepping out onto the porch, watching the giant man chop firewood with effortless rhythmic strikes. She noticed how he never drank. She noticed how he spoke to his horse. She realized with a slow, blooming sense of wonder that this terrifying mountain man was the safest harbor she had ever known. One crisp morning, Beau was mending a fence post near the cabin when the front door creaked open. He paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. Matilda stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing a new, simple cotton dress Beau had bought from the mercantile. Her dark hair was washed and brushed, falling softly over her shoulders. In her hands, she held a tin cup of steaming coffee. She walked down the steps, her bare feet touching the cold dirt, and held the cup out to him. Her hands were shaking, but she didn't look away. "You'll freeze to death out here, Mr. Thatcher," she said softly. Beau took the cup, their fingers brushing for just a fraction of a second. A strange, unfamiliar warmth bloomed in his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Thank you, Matilda." For a moment they just stood there, the broken bride and the solitary trapper, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The nightmare was ending. A new life was beginning. But out on the western frontier, peace was a luxury rarely afforded to the honest. A sharp, shrill whistle shattered the morning silence. Beau turned, his eyes narrowing. Kicking up a massive cloud of dust on the valley road were 4 riders. At the front of the pack, wearing a tailored black suit and a silver-studded holster, was Amos McCoy. Flanking him were 3 heavily armed thugs, former Pinkerton enforcers, known for breaking strikes and breaking legs. Beau set the coffee cup on the fence post and instinctively pushed Matilda behind him, shielding her entirely with his massive frame. McCoy pulled his black stallion to a halt, 10 yards from the cabin, tipping his bowler hat with a mockingly polite smile. "Morning, Thatcher." McCoy called out, his voice oily and loud. "Nice work you've done with the place, truly." But it seems Judge Baxter made a slight clerical error regarding the auction. There was no error, McCoy. Beau rumbled his hand, slowly dropping to rest on the handle of his Colt. Get off my land. McCoy sighed in exaggerated disappointment. The land is yours, Beau. Paid in full. But Jebediah Rutledge accrued a rather hefty interest penalty the night before he fled. An extra $500. Now, since the deed to the property was settled, the only asset left to seize to cover that interest is the collateral. McCoy's cold, dead eyes shifted from Beau to the trembling woman hiding behind him. Hand over the girl, Thatcher. She belongs to the silver dollar now. Beau didn't blink. He didn't shout. He simply reached over his shoulder and smoothly slid his heavy Winchester lever-action rifle from the scabbard strapped to the fence. He racked the lever with a metallic clack that echoed like a thunderclap across the valley. The only thing you're taking from this farm, McCoy, Beau said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm, is a wooden box. The metallic clack of Beau's Winchester, echoing across the valley, froze the blood of every man present. McCoy's black stallion sidestepped nervous, sensing the sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere. The three Pinkerton thugs flanking McCoy stiffened their hands, hovering over their holstered revolvers. But they were city killers used to intimidating indebted gamblers and breaking the jaws of unarmed miners. They hadn't survived a decade in the brutal, unforgiving Bitterroot mountain range, fighting off freezing winters, timber wolves, and starvation. Beau Thatcher was a different breed of lethal, and it radiated from his massive frame like heat from a forge. You're making a grave mistake, mountain man. McCoy spat the oily veneer of his voice, cracking to reveal the venom underneath. That piece of paper Baxter signed don't mean a damn thing if you're dead. The territorial law is on my side. Beau didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. I don't recognize the law of men who sell women to settle bar tabs. You take one more step onto this property, McCoy, and your men will be packing you back to Helena in a saddlebag. To prove his point, Beau didn't aim at McCoy's chest. He aimed slightly down and pulled the trigger. The heavy .44-40 caliber bullet struck the silver spur on McCoy's left boot, shattering it into jagged shrapnel and sending his horse rearing into the air with a terrified whinny. McCoy scrambled to stay in the saddle, his face draining of color. "You're a dead man, Thatcher," he screamed, struggling to control his mount. "I'll be back at sundown with 20 men. We'll burn this cabin to the ground and take the girl from your ashes." The four riders wheeled around and galloped back toward town, leaving a cloud of thick, choking dust in their wake. Beau lowered the rifle, his jaw set like granite. He turned to Matilda. She was pale, her hands gripping the wooden railing of the porch, so tightly her knuckles were white, but she wasn't crying. The sheer terror he expected to see was absent, replaced by a hardened, desperate resolve. "Pack whatever you can carry into a saddlebag," Beau ordered, his tone brisk and commanding. "I'm putting you on Goliath. He's the strongest draft horse in the territory. You'll ride north to Fort Benton. There's an honest federal marshal stationed there. I'll hold McCoy's men off here." Matilda didn't move. She looked at the giant man, the man who had slept in the freezing mud, just so she could have a bed, and slowly shook her head. "I ran from St. Louis," Matilda said, her voice trembling, but gaining strength with every word. "I ran from my family to marry Jebediah, and I tried to run from him, which is why he chained me like a dog. I am done running, Mr. Thatcher. I am not property, and I will not leave the only home I've ever felt safe in." Beau stared at her, genuinely stunned. Beneath her frail, bruised exterior was a spine of absolute steel. He gave a single slow nod of respect. "If you stay," Beau said, walking up the steps and pressing a heavy Colt revolver into her hands, "you fight. You aim for the chest and you don't hesitate. Do you understand?" "I understand," she whispered, her fingers wrapping around the cold iron grip. "For the rest of the day, The Rutledge farm was turned into a fortress. Bo dragged heavy sacks of grain and flour to barricade the windows. He chopped down thick pine logs to brace the front and back doors. He loaded every weapon he owned, 2 Winchester rifles, a double-barreled stagecoach shotgun, and 3 revolvers, laying them out systematically on the kitchen table. As the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Elkhorn Mountains, painting the Montana sky in violent shades of crimson and bruised purple, the valley fell dead silent. Then the rhythmic thud of galloping hooves began to vibrate through the floorboards. Through a narrow gap in the barricaded window, Bo counted the torches. McCoy hadn't been bluffing. A mob of over 20 heavily armed mercenaries, drunks, and bounty hunters had surrounded the cabin. "Thatcher," McCoy's voice rang out from the darkness. "Last chance, send out the girl and you get to keep your dirt." Bo's answer was a deafening blast from his Winchester. A mercenary holding a torch screamed and dropped to the dirt. Instantly the night erupted in a hail of gunfire. Lead rained against the cabin, splintering the pine boards and shattering the remaining glass. Bo moved with terrifying speed and precision, moving from window to window, returning fire in measured, deadly bursts. Every time his rifle cracked, a man outside fell. In the corner, Matilda methodically reloaded the empty revolvers Bo tossed to her, her hands coated in gunpowder and grease. She was terrified, but she didn't stop moving. For an hour, the siege raged on. Bo had taken down 7 men, and the mob was beginning to fracture in fear of the mountain man's lethal accuracy. But Amos McCoy was a man of vicious, cunning desperation. "Bring up the dynamite," McCoy bellowed. A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Bo's blood ran cold. He peered through the crack and saw 2 men rushing the side of the cabin, lighting short fuses on bundles of mining explosives. No. Bo roared. He knew the blast would collapse the roof instantly. He looked back at Matilda, who was clutching the Colt, her eyes wide with sudden realization. "Matilda, get in the cellar!" Bo yelled. "Bo, no," she screamed, but it was too late. Bo unbarred the front door and kicked it open, stepping out onto the porch with his hands raised deliberately, drawing their fire away from the side of the house. "I surrender," Bo shouted. Before he could drop his weapons, a Pinkerton thug struck him from behind with the butt of a rifle. Bo collapsed to his knees, his vision exploding in white, hot flashes of pain. The mob swarmed him, kicking and beating the mountain man until he was unconscious. McCoy stepped onto the porch, a sickening smile twisting his face. He kicked open the door and found Matilda standing in the center of the room. She raised the Colt, but a thug grabbed her from behind, wrenching the gun from her grip and slamming her to the floor. "Look at the mess you've made, my dear," McCoy sneered, looking down at her. "Tie the mountain man to the back of a horse. We're taking him to town, and gag the girl. She's going to work." Bo Thatcher awoke to the bitter sting of a bucket of ice water hitting his face. He was chained to a heavy oak hitching post in the muddy street directly outside the Silver Dollar Saloon in Helena. His ribs felt shattered, and his right eye was swollen shut. It was mid-morning. A crowd of nervous townsfolk had gathered, kept back by a line of McCoy's armed men. "Wake up, mountain man," McCoy laughed, standing on the boardwalk, sipping a glass of bourbon. "I want you conscious when the sheriff reads the charges: horse thievery, murder, and theft of property. The penalty is hanging. And look who came to watch." McCoy gestured to the saloon doors. 2 Pinkertons dragged Matilda out onto the boardwalk. They had forced her into a scandalous, brightly colored silk dress, the uniform of the saloon's working women. Her face was pale, but her eyes, locked onto Bo, were burning with a fierce, unyielding fury. Sheriff Clayton Briggs, a man entirely on McCoy's payroll, stepped forward with a piece of parchment. By the authority of the territory, he began to read. But he was cut off by the thunderous roar of a stagecoach shotgun discharging into the air. The crowd screamed and parted. Riding down the center of the muddy street was not just a lone man. but a legend of the frontier United States Marshal Harrison Wade. Flanking him was Dr. Horace Meade, holding a smoking shotgun, and riding right beside them, leading Beau's massive draft horse, Goliath, was Matilda. McCoy dropped his glass. The woman on the boardwalk, the one he had forced into silk, was just one of his saloon girls in a wig. The real Matilda had escaped through the cabin's cellar during the chaos of Beau's beating, dug up the remaining gold Beau had buried in the barn, and ridden straight to Dr. Meade, who had immediately summoned the federal marshal from the neighboring county. "Sheriff Briggs." Marshal Wade bellowed his deep voice, carrying undeniable federal authority. "Drop that fraudulent warrant before I have you arrested for treason against the territorial court. Now see here, Wade," McCoy shouted, panic finally edging into his voice. "That man murdered my employees, and that woman is my legal property, transferred by Jebediah Rutledge for an unpaid debt." Marshal Wade pulled a heavy leather-bound ledger from his saddlebag and tossed it into the mud at McCoy's feet. "That is the Federal Anti-Peonage Act of 1867. Wade declared, loudly ensuring the entire town heard him. It strictly outlaws the classification of a human being as collateral or chattel to settle a debt. Jebediah Rutledge's transfer was federally illegal, and according to the county clerk, Beau Thatcher paid $2,000 in raw gold for Lot 71, satisfying all debts attached to the estate. The land is his. The woman is free, and you, Amos McCoy, are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." McCoy's face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He wasn't about to lose his town to a piece of paper. He drew his revolver, aiming directly at Marshal Wade. "Kill them all," McCoy screamed to his men. But McCoy forgot about the mountain man chained to the post. With a guttural roar that sounded more bear than human, Beau wrapped the heavy iron chain around the wooden post and twisted his entire body weight against it. The rusted iron link, weakened by years of Montana winters, snapped with a violent crack. Before McCoy could pull his trigger, Beau lunged forward. The heavy, broken length of chain whipped through the air, striking McCoy squarely in the chest and sending him crashing backward through the swinging doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon. Chaos erupted. Marshal Wade and Dr. Meade opened fire, driving McCoy's thugs into the alleys. Beau didn't stop. He stepped into the saloon, his massive fists flying. The remaining Pinkertons inside, terrified by the sheer bloody resilience of the giant trapper, threw their weapons down and surrendered. McCoy lay on the floorboards, gasping for air, his ribs crushed by the chain. Beau stood over him, breathing heavily, blood dripping from his beard. He could have ended the tyrant right there. But he had promised Matilda a home, not a graveyard. Beau turned his back on McCoy and walked out into the sunlight. The gunfire had ceased. The street was quiet. Matilda slid down from Goliath's saddle and ran through the mud, heedless of the dirt ruining her new dress. She collided with Beau, throwing her arms around his massive chest, burying her face into his coat. Beau wrapped his heavy arms around her, closing his eyes, letting the warmth of her presence wash away the pain of his injuries. The town of Helena watched in stunned silence as the savage mountain man and the broken bride clung to each other, unbroken and victorious. According to the historical archives of Lewis and Clark County, Amos McCoy was sent to a federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, where he died of fever 3 years later. Beau and Matilda Thatcher returned to the prickly Pear Valley. The small rundown cabin was eventually replaced by a sprawling timber mansion. Over the next 40 years, the Thatcher Ranch became the largest and most prosperous cattle empire in the Montana Territory, and until the day he died, an old gray-bearded man. Beau Thatcher never slept outside in the cold again. If you were captivated by this thrilling tale of frontier justice romance and unyielding courage, don't let the story end here. Like this video to show your support for these incredible real-life historical legends. Share it with your friends who love an epic Western drama, and hit that subscribe button for more untold stories of the wild, untamed American frontier. Let us know in the comments what part of Beau and Matilda's incredible journey shocked you the most.